Welcome to an hour of power. I am Keith Anthony Blanchard, spiritual teacher, musician, author of the best-selling book Homecoming: Crossing the Bridge to the Soul, and your host of Center of Light. Let's dive in.
In this reason for a while, clarity. Trust me. You don't have to trust me, you'll find out for yourself, but trust me if you want to save yourself some bumps and bruises and contusions. Center of Light, Center of Divine Unfoldment and Reinforcement. Strap in, actually take the seatbelt off. In life, take the seatbelt off. In a car, put it on. I am having some issues with the internet because of the iced snowstorm. In fact, I'm looking at my software and it's saying drop frames detected, drop frames detected. If it sputters here and there, that's one thing, but if it just solidly freezes, there's no point if we can't hear what my guest tonight, Mr. John Gastil, would have to say about his new book, Dungeon Party. Role-playing, right? We're going to find out what that's all about. I don't know if it means what it sounds like, right? Actually, it does. It means exactly that, because that's what life is. Life is a sexual, sensual dance with, and everybody's your partner, whether you're straight, homo, whatever you are. So it's about role-playing in a dungeon. You know, I don't really like investigating too much of my guests, their work. I like it to be organic and raw. I like the virgin of it, actually. So hopefully, if we can move forth, doesn't look good. He's going to tell us all about it. Let me see what's happening. Let me get the feedback from the audience. Everyone in YouTube land, exclamation point, continue forth, or not good, if you would. Hello, Facebook. Hello, everyone in the UK, Pulse Talk Radio. My brand new platform I'm able to join thanks to Carl War, founder, executive, Big Daddy himself. So they're creating a new website. So where there's going to be interactive chat rooms, so forth and so on. But everyone on Pulse Talk, thank you very much, even if this is only for the moment because of technology being wonky as it is right now, and the unfortunate of the ice storm. Again, for Pulse Talk listeners in the UK, if you send me an email at Keith Anthony Blanchard and say, hey, Keith, I want my free gift. That way I know we are communicating. I will send you one. And I'm looking at technology right now and things are freezing. And everybody says, let's move forward. So let's move forward until we can no longer. Keith Anthony Blanchard here, Center of Light Radio. Let me tell you about my guest. This is just so not me being in this wonky state. I have high dollar gear. I pay top internet soul provider kind of thing. John Gastil is distinguished professor in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences at the Pennsylvania State University, where he is senior scholar at the McCourtney Institute for Democracy. His most recent books includes 2 novels, Gray Matters, links all, I'm going to say this correctly, I don't know about you, John, but it just, one of those things, pet peeve of mine when people call it Alzheimer's, it's Alzheimer's, and American politics, and he's shaking his head, yes, I get it. And Dungeon Party explores how fantasy role-playing games shape our lives. I did post his links to his website, where you can find more about him and what he does. And if you would stomp all over his page and make a big stink and let him know you exist. John, welcome to Center of Light, my friend. I did it for ratings, bro. You got to give me some. And while I got this moment, everyone in the audience, if you would, I'm just no longer going to worry about this technology stuff. You send me a message when it's time to say, can it? Because I would love to reschedule versus everyone missing the point on the presence of Mr. John. So, John, please continue. Where would you like to go, sir? Excuse me, John. Excuse me, John. Are you? My guest, or excuse me, my audience is saying that you are muted. I can hear you fine. Are you muted in such a way that I can hear you and they can't? Well, try that now.
Okay, let's see if your
That's
audience
it.
can
That's
hear me
it.
now.
I'm in the habit of doing my presentations, which I mute this side. My apologies. Please tell us where you would like to lead us into this interview, sir. I am so sorry.
No, no worries at all. And thank you for your audience who is observant. So where we can go anywhere you want today in terms of what we talk about. The novel Dungeon Party is one of the first novels to take seriously, from a literary standpoint, the experience of playing fantasy role-playing games. Some of your folks in the audience have probably played games like D&D, or a role-playing game in any number of settings, a Western, a sci-fi, you name it. But for those who haven't played, it's sometimes kind of confusing. Nobody understands how such a game works. It's as simple as this. There's lots of details, but just picture a group of people sitting around a table, or this year, sitting at their respective desks or tables in Zoom, um, and essentially telling a story together. In a game like Dungeons and Dragons, there's a person called the Dungeon Master who kind of guides the story and has more control over what's happening, but really, in an important sense, everyone is just taking part in that story. They're saying what their character does, and yeah, the dungeon master gets to make some decisions about what happens, but it really is collective storytelling. That's what it comes down to.
Sounds like the human dynamic.
Well,
It
it
is.
is.
Well, yeah,
Well, it
because
is.
we're all incorporated in this arcade game room virtual reality. You know, it's not so cold really because everything is we're related to it, our family, our jobs. That's very sacred stuff. But beyond being so attached to this 3D world, there's another world that exists that is not so interested or invested in 3D stuff. And it says, you know, it may be real for you down here, but the real game action is happening up here. And
Well, that's, in a metaphorical sense, a fantasy role-playing game takes that exact position. It says, we are all sitting here at a table, or we're communicating through Skype or Zoom or what have you, but we're going to talk about a different world. We're going to talk about an imaginary world. We're going to talk about a world where I'm not John. Maybe I'm a sorcerer named Santana. And in fact, I do get together and play a Dungeons and Dragons game with folks who aren't even all in the town here where I live. And I know each of them almost more as their character than as the actual person who plays that character. And we all talk about this fictional world where our characters live and unfortunately, in some cases, die. And that's the reality we're talking about. That's the reality we're investing in. That's the reality we're preparing for each Sunday when we're getting ready to play. And again, the novel Dungeon Party describes that experience of gaming for people who take it very seriously, and how it affects them. And it can have really positive effects on you to have this fantasy, to explore maybe a different part of your personality, to test your courage. But it can have some downsides too. You can kind of lose your way. You can get so invested in that other world that you become a little bit untethered in this one. And I know folks who have read the novel, before they finish it, they kind of wonder as they're going through it, what is really happening here? Because the novel is both about the real world of San Diego, California is where it's set, and this fantasy world, the mythos where their characters are in this game. And readers start to wonder pretty early on in the novel if there isn't some connection between those worlds. I'm not giving it away.
It's so parallels. It's so parallels. I mean, where are we connecting? In fact, in all of human history, in all of universal history, we are we're beyond the cusp. We've taken 5-10 steps into the threshold of upgrading our gaming package, PlayStation 1000, whatever it is you're doing. It's so parallels. John, tell me about this satanic panic. What is it?
Sure. So it's surprising to people who haven't really kept up with role-playing games to hear that right now in the year 2021, these games are bigger than they've ever been. And again, there's so many different games out there that we talk about Dungeons and Dragons as though it is fantasy role playing, but it's really just one incredibly powerful example, sure. But there's even other games like Pathfinder in its same genre, but then there's every genre you can imagine. But back in the 70s and early 80s, when Dungeons and Dragons was more dominant within the genre, um, as it ascended really for the first time, there was a panic about it. This was around the same time that conservative Christian churches in the United States were worried about backwards, backmasking backwards lyrics on, rock albums, and is there some connection between the Eagles and the Church of Satan, and all these suspicions about rock and roll and Satanism and so on. I mean, it had gotten to the point where there were actually bands who were like, "Oh yeah, let's lean into that," right? That movie, um, where they're kind of live action role playing. And he has some sort of psychotic break in a steam tunnel. It's really got to be his worst film. If one of your listeners wants to argue with that, they may know one that I haven't seen. But that satanic panic really was the fear that our sons and daughters playing this game are not just playing a game, that their souls are going to be consumed by some dark supernatural force. And they will turn into, witches or warlocks, and make deals with the devil. I have to say, in retrospect, I I have almost a little sympathy for someone in a church like that who panicked about a game like D&D, because if you do take a close look at it, you actually do learn lots of stuff about the occult. You learn all the different kinds of demons. You appreciate that hell is a bureaucratic organization, and it has some horizontal integration with other afterworlds that are not pleasant. And if you believe in there's only one God, well, D&D has a whole book of all the different gods you could choose for your priest. So it is full of mythology and fiction, including occult fiction. And yeah, it could make you kind of panic if you're trying to teach your kid, the Bible is a sacred, and that could freak you out a little.
Let me ask you this, sir. Most people get attached to the word occult, the word cult, meaning the negative connotation kind of thing. Being a learned man, a scholarly man, what is cult? I see cult as, Christianity's a cult. Doing what you do every day is a cult. Your social environment, your religious upbringing, your familial upbringing, it's all cult. It's a way of following one way of thinking. So this is a cult. Most people think cult automatically means this, this dragon, this horrible thing. But people who are so willing to point the finger don't really realize that their whole life has been in cultic nature, in a cultic diagram or model. Would you agree with that, or could you describe it some other way?
I will describe it a different way, and we're playing with words here a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of. I mean, language is a game. It's a big old game, right? Let's play with a few words. Let's take the words cult, culture, occult, and inculcation. So you and I live in an incredibly complex time culturally. Through most of human history, one's cultural inheritance had geographic boundaries, a kind of time and space boundaries that, if I knew you were from Sherwood Forest, something we were talking about before the show, I'd know a few things about you. I'd know, what kind of music you might be familiar with, and so on. Now, it's anyone's guess what John and Keith want to listen to when they turn on music. I mean, actually, we do have a guest with you since we've seen a little music, but the cultural influences are so complex, so diverse, that it's in an important sense, people have the opportunity to kind of make themselves in a unique way, maybe to a degree that didn't exist when we were inculcated in a particular set of traditions more more strictly. Now, to say that, we'll take the word occult, and we'll say, okay, now that's a category of things. It's a bunch of things, right? Beliefs and texts and music and practices and so on. And it's pretty vaguely defined, but it includes all sorts of things that are, let's say, outside of some, really it's mainstream Christian religions that are trying to define the other as this kind of a cult. And then we'll say cult is something really different from that. And I'm comfortable narrowing the definition of what is an actual cult quite a bit, just so that words mean different things. And so, for instance, one of the requirements for a cult, as I define it, I actually do study small groups, and I always have students interested in writing papers about cults. And one of the things I'll push them on is, to truly be in a cult, there needs to be some degree of isolation, and there needs to be some degree of control. And one of the hallmarks of a cult is really cutting off your social ties, and limiting the information that comes into you, the people you can have regular contact with. And
John,
so,
excuse me, sir.
yeah,
Would you
sure.
say that is, at least in my perception, that is true? That is true in the sense that we only, birds of a feather flock together. We cut ties by our by what we believe. In other words, we may meet someone, hey, my name is so and so, and you talk for a little while, and it seems that there's an unnatural cognitive dissonance that happens simply by belief. You're a nice guy, a nice person, so thank you very much. So, but as much as I like you and want to hang around you, something inside me says, I just don't feel comfortable about the nonsense that's spewing around in my head.
Well, I think by degrees, I can agree
Agreed.
with you.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed.
so we know people who we might say, yeah, she and her friends, they're kind of cult-like, right? Or actually in academia, we say that sometimes when there's a group of academics, maybe, it's about 10 or 20 of them who are all studying the same thing, all using the same methods of research, and they're very hard to communicate with. They're very defensive. They celebrate each other's work, but seem to not read anyone else unless they're just going to refute, just reject them. And we say they're kind of cultish, right? And it's a real mark of shame in academia. If someone says you're kind of cult-like, that's bad news, because you're supposed to be doing the opposite. You're supposed to be reading what everybody's writing, being engaged in an open conversation, right? So I think we do see it socially, we do see it professionally, and it freaks us out a little bit. Some companies, right, are described sometimes as cult-like in how they treat their employees and kind of draw them in, right? Some families are kind of cult-like. The novel is about the gaming community, and I think sometimes gamers from a distance are perceived as sort of weird, maybe even cult-like. Oh, these video game people, they just hang out with, each other and they don't talk to anyone. And the people who go to the, Comic-Con or whatever, they dress up in weird costumes and so on. The funny thing is, though, as you get to know these people, they couldn't be less cult-like, in the sense that they tend to be pretty open-hearted. They tend to be very open-minded. They tend to be super creative. And their friendships and networks tend to be very fluid. They welcome in new people, people move away, all kinds of things happen in their lives, but there is a sense of kind of welcoming and community that I think from a distance can be misunderstood as kind of cliquish and exclusive and maybe even cult-like. Maybe that's also partly because their specialized knowledge in things that you didn't even know existed can be a little bit astounding. When they start arguing about, well, mithril, that's not a kind of armor that could withstand a bolt from that kind of a crossbow. And you're like, I don't think mithril exists. What are you talking about? Right? Well, they're really into it and they've read all about it. And again, that can freak people out.
Tell me about this game director and the guy that makes the rules.
Yeah, so this really varies from one game to the other. In Dungeon Party, one of the main characters, Alan, is the game director, and he had played the game pretty conventionally. That is, you might buy a module, a book that sort of describes a setting and a set of adventures your group might have, and he would then lead them through those adventures. They'd make choices along the way, and the book would sort of tell them what they might encounter and so on. So it's kind of a story that's already written, but it gets to be played out uniquely every time. But in Dungeon Party, he's kind of reached a turning point where he starts to make up the game fresh. And he introduces things into the game world that didn't previously exist, psyches of his players in ways that they're starting to notice, and it freaks them out a little bit, but it's kind of exciting because you get the feeling that he's not working from a story that's already been written and published. The story is happening live, and we don't know how it's going to end. And that's an exciting way to play. And there are people who can pull that off. But as you can imagine, that's a lot harder than simply having a story structure and walking people through it.
How is the paranormal world represented in fantasy role-playing games? Are there psychics and werewolves? I love it already. Are there psychics and werewolves? Or are they just the sorts of character ones find in the Lord of the Rings? All good. I love all that stuff, man.
All of the above. Your first sign is, of course there are werewolves. Of course there are. But there are weird rats. There's weird bears. There's weird anything you want. That's what you start to realize when there literally was a book in D&D called the Monster Manual, and there's various iterations of it. Well, that's not a manual in the sense that these are the only monsters that can exist in the world, and I'll describe them for you in excruciating detail. That's true. But you can make up your own monsters. And even when I was a kid, I was making up my own monsters. They weren't super creative, but sky's the limit. And so
that sounds like most of humanity. We always make up our own monsters unconsciously, versus from an artistic, creative way.
We do, but as in D&D, they're usually based on things that are familiar. There's some degree of familiarity. So, for example, in Dungeon Party, the fairies play an important role in the story. You don't see them at first, but they do come along. But they're what Alan imagines fairies to be, not what you think they are. And so that familiarity, fairies, I know about fairies, right? I've seen them in movies, in stories and so on. I know I know the fairy folk, right? So that familiarity is good because it connects you to them. They're not just some abstract concept on the page that you're like, what is that? But then when you get to see how Alan represents fairies, you're like, oh, those weren't the fairies I had in mind, right? And that's fun. So that's, when these fantasy role-playing games are at their best, there is, and this is true of fantasy literature in general, there's enough of the familiar to kind of keep you connected and draw you in, but there's enough of the unfamiliar to make you excited, to know that you don't know what's around that corner. In the campaign I'm playing in with some friends, we just opened up this door, and it sure did look like a door to the underworld. And, sure enough, some bad things came out and basically introduced themselves and said, yeah, you go down that door, it is going to be the end of you. And we're going to start, we'll demonstrate for you right now what a bad decision. The end of my character, right? I mean, my sorcerer, I'm actually playing Santana, a character from the novel Dungeon Party, just for fun, to see what it's like to play the game with someone I'd written about. And I'm kind of attached to him. I don't want him to die. And if things get kind of hairy down there, he might flee, right? I mean, he's a little bit brave. He's a little bit proud. But he also wants to see the sunrise tomorrow morning. So, that kind of thing happens in these games. I mean, as long as you're true to the conception of your character, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's around the corner. But neither does the game director really know what's going to happen. And that can be really exciting. Just to see the game play out. And it's fun to surprise the person who's kind of supposed to be running the show. And again, that happens in a good game. Just as you're surprised by your guests, even though you guide the conversation, that happens in a good role-playing game too.
How is your dreamscape at night?
Interestingly, I was just talking with a friend the other night. I never have recurring dreams. One thing I do in my dreams, which actually does relate right back to Dungeon Party, which is every once in a while, I hope you have these too, because I think they're wonderful. I have a dream that kind of tests something out for me. Like in the dream, I make a really momentous decision, and then I wake up feeling that I've made the decision, and I get the split second of believing it happened, and I get to see how I feel about it. Right. And in Dungeon Party, you get to kind of do that with your character. That is the people in the novel are doing something in the fantasy world, and maybe maybe in a way it's testing themselves. Like, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I let loyalty come to the fore and I sacrificed my own needs? Would I survive? Would I be rewarded? How would I feel about it, right? And so they get to kind of test it out, maybe in the same way my dreams test things out. So yeah, I do have interesting dreams sometimes, but it's interesting that they're never recurring. And that's how I would like my fantasy role-playing games to be too. I would never want to feel like I was playing the same game twice.
Did you like the movie Ready Player One?
I sure did. Actually, it's funny you mentioned
I love it. My son and I, we went to the IMAX theater in the IMAX view, and it was just loud.
And she and I talked about it a little bit. And she said, well, you've got to read Ready Player One. It had just come out. The novel had long before the movie. And fortunately, I had finished Dungeon Party at that point, because when I started reading that book, I was like, okay, this is fantastic. And it is one of the titles that I used when I was getting an agent and finding a publisher. That was one of the titles I would use for a comparison, is Ready Player One, because it is a novel about people playing a game. The big difference between Dungeon Party and a lot of stories like that is that Dungeon Party is about our world, our real world, and the people playing games in it. Yeah, it's about the game too, but novels like Ready Player One are much more kind of action adventure. The game is this incredible thing that doesn't exist in a sci-fi future and so on. And Dungeon Party, I'm actually really trying to ground it in the psychological reality of your life, mine, and those around us. And in that sense, it is really much more kind of a literary novel about a particular subculture. And so it is this funny mix of a fantasy novel and a contemporary literature novel.
Here's a Keith Blanchard Center of Light radio question for you. Listening to you, enjoying you, no, not listening to you. Yes, listening, not hearing, but listening to you. It sounds exactly what I do, but in a virtual way. The game player one kind of thing. Wow, you surprised me kind of thing. Was this with you all along, since your birth, becoming conscious within yourself? Where do you think this inspiration comes from? What inspired you to have this storyline, this of your life, to say, I'm going to invest, engage, put in my quarter into this machine and stay with it as long as I do? What is that inspiration for you? Was it with you, or is it something that just happened overnight, or?
Oh, there's so many parts to that answer. I love the question, Keith. And let me try to honor it with an answer that kind of touches on a few different elements. First of all, I do agree with you that you and I are doing a kind of interactive, making of reality in this interview, as in any good interview, where we don't entirely know where it's going. We feel like something spontaneous is happening. Now imagine if you had three guests at once, right? And you guided it, but also just let us interact. And that really is much more like, people sitting around playing a game and creating kids who was always kind of crafting stories. We all do. I mean, stories in, narrative is huge in human civilization. But I remember hearing a really poignant, sad autobiographical account of childhood from the author Sherman Alexie, who had grown up on a res in Eastern Washington state, and he had played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid by himself. As he described it, I mean, he was just too nerdy for the res, and he could play basketball. He could do a few things as he still plays, I understand. But the love for D&D was not going to go over well on the res, and so he just basically played indoors by himself, and it was his own game. Now imagine playing an interactive game like that with nobody. That is, you're the dungeon master, you're all the characters, you're the players. It's basically solitaire. And is it really that surprising that he went on to become a very successful author, right? He's written screenplays, novels, poems, and so on. Well, I mean, that's the same thing. It's telling stories. You're sitting there with your keyboard in this case, and getting it done. So I identify with that a little bit. I used to make board games when I was a kid. I didn't really have many people to play them with necessarily, but I would just keep cranking them out. My mom got me a little laminating kit so I could laminate them. And and I've just kept playing games and writing my whole life, and maybe it was kind of inevitable at some point I'd want to write about playing games. And I was surprised that there wasn't more fiction about gaming culture. There are a couple novels.
I love the name of that.
Yeah, no, it's very strange.
That is so
That
is so underworld.
It's a very funny satirical novel. And I think Battle at the Comic Book Expo is a newer self-published title, again about the convention and what happens there. And Dungeon Party does lead to the Middle Mirth Convention, which features prominently in the second half of the novel. So, yeah, I think it's being a kid who's a little bit obsessive, has always been writing, has always been making games. Maybe it wasn't so surprising that I wrote about people playing a game.
What can we learn about the links between the normal and the paranormal, and the subnormal and the abnormal, and what all the normals? What can we learn about that as far as playing these games? Does what we do in a fantasy world have any link back to our real lives? Again, this is so parallel. It's so you and I are dancing the same dance in two different universes. It sounds like the same thing. So, if you would answer that question, what can we do to link the paranormal to the normal and all the other normals?
First of all, I love that you do see the connections and parallels between our worlds.
Easy.
Anyone watching this video feed can appreciate that on the one hand, we have sort of gothic horror role-playing world with that incredible throne and your candles and so on. And then it's unclear what I'm doing, but it's some kind of popular cultural riffing. This is RoboCop the musical behind me, which I guarantee you no one in your audience saw or heard. But, I have to put it there for my, weird, cultural critic cred or something. So I'm playing my own game, right, with my visuals as much as you are. But I think the biggest takeaway for gamers from gaming and being a part of the gaming community, I love this word normal, is that they come to recognize that normal is a prison. That who wants to be normal? Right? Normal means, in line with the norms. And there's nothing wrong with broadly having cultural norms. I mean, it's what, gives the police some time off. Right? I mean, we want people to be normal to some degree and observe, basic norms of decency and so on. But we also want some deviance. The artist Salvador Dali famously, I'm sure this is apocryphal, but who cares? It's very much in line with him. Apparently at a restaurant once, a waiter brought him a menu and he slammed his fist on the table and said, "Will no one ever deliver me a flaming phone book?" And the point was just, why does it always have to be a menu? Right? When you sit at a restaurant and they bring you something, why don't they bring you something, why don't they bring you something completely unrelated, right? It would just make him laugh. It would delight him. He'd probably go to that restaurant every day for the rest of his life. So that's what fantasy role-playing gamers, I think, start to appreciate, is that as much as we need some norms to have, a civilization and so on, we also need some deviance. We need some creativity. We need something to be unpredictable. And the game gives you that in a very safe way. That is, in the fantasy of the game, you can do that. But what you see is gamers in the gaming community often become kind of deviant in all kinds of wonderful ways in the real world. Yeah, they still have jobs. They may be pulling more down with their IT, career than many of us ever will. But they also get to indulge all sorts of, ideas and expressions of themselves. And probably one of them has a chair that looks like yours. So there you go.
One thing I love, bro, is passion. And you reek it. You stink of it. I love it. I inhale it. I drink of it. I love passion. So when is it Gastil or Gastil?
I accept all pronunciations, Keith.
What is your pronunciation?
Gastil is the way
Gastil.
It's said historically, but we're suspicious that it might be
Mine
Gastil.
sounds a little more sexy. Gastil.
Gastil.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
So when John Gastil is doing what he does, which he loves, how does it... This is a question I ask most of them, I guess, when it comes across my conscious stream. But I think out of all the questions I can ever ask my guests who are as passionate as you, as me, as to why I'm talking about this, In your passion, what does it feel like? In your best attempts, literal word on purpose, what does it feel like to be you?
Yeah, that's kind of an easy one.
Really? Love it.
Yeah, it
Lay it
is.
out. Lay it
Uh,
out.
you've probably run into the word flow, or the phrase flow state. So there's a whole bunch of cool research on this about it's a kind of state of mind, a state of being you can get into when you're really doing what you're kind of meant to be doing right then, right there. Um, for me, writing this novel, I would feel myself getting into that flow state when, and that the word works so well, when the words were just flowing right out of me. Now, granted, that was the shitty first draft, and I apologize if that word is too strong for your audience.
Oh
But
my God.
it's actually a technical term used in writing, that you've got to. I mean, it's a very productive way of writing. Is you just get the first draft done, right? Don't try stopping yourself. Don't edit. Just finish it, and then you'll see what you've got. And there was a lot of revision to be done with Dungeon Party, but that flow state would come while I was writing, and it would just like time disappears. Everything is making sense. But then what I didn't expect that was actually more exciting, and I've heard from some writers that this is true for a lot of them. If you're going to be a successful writer, you have to love writing, sure, but you have to love editing. I know that sounds crazy, but I made a point of working with some professional writers as editors before I came to my publisher. And the very first one, I had this guy, Paul Whitcover, who's written some wonderful books. He has a beautiful theory of editing for a story, which is that if the story is healthy, if it's a good story and it's worth editing and worth publishing, everything that's wrong with it can be solved by what's already in the story. Now, you may
It's
not
a
have
lot like removing the clay from the statue of David of the marble. You and I spoke about this in the radio green room. My editor, Stella, like I said, she was a bag lady. We'd go to buffets. She goes, Keith, make sure no one's looking. I said, no, that's on you. But she'd put pieces of pizza in a bag. That's who she was. But when it comes to the English
Now I want
language,
pizza. Thank you for that.
she was so superior. She said that, Keith, understand that you say something once or twice very powerfully, very clearly, very unextraneous, if that's a word. I just invented one. There's no need to mention it anymore. She took my manuscript of The Divine Principle, my first bestseller, from God knows how many thousands upon multiple thousands of words and reduced it. She would take a page of information, and she would reduce it to a paragraph. And she goes, read it. And I'm like, oh, God. She had a gift. So I understand the removal is not only equally as important. I think it's more important because, like you said, being a writer for many years myself, I failed English 4 times. I had to quit school. I failed typing twice. And I'm a best-selling artist. So my point is, this is not the bestseller. I've climbed the mountain of Everest through the nonsense of what I thought needed to happen to be successful in that regard. And so what she taught me was, when you say something once or twice, there's no need to say it anymore. But what she taught me is that the greatest dialogue happens in the empty space between the words. Would you agree?
I love it. Yeah, I was also reading a little bit of Cormac McCarthy when I was working on Dungeon Party, who is a famously sparse writer. For those who haven't had the pleasure of reading The Road, maybe you saw the movie that came out several years ago, sort of post-apocalyptic story, you discover that he doesn't use quotation marks, and he doesn't attribute dialogue to anyone in particular. So when there's a conversation, it's just one line of dialogue after another, and you just have to know who's talking. And it's very bold. But if the writing is strong enough and the voices are clear enough, you can tell who's talking. Now, I didn't have success reading every one of his books that way, but it did work for me with The Road. And one of the takeaways for me with Dungeon Party is really very much less is more. And sure, I can say that Alan said this or Maya said that, just to give the reader a break. But I can also cut that back a lot, right? And I can trust the reader. And in other words, it's getting out of the way of the reader. You say, that there's meaning in the empty spaces and so on. You just keep writing, it's like when exposition gets out of hand and you're telling the reader, and instead of just showing them and letting them experience it and draw their own inferences. And that was one of the things I was definitely doing with Dungeon Party. But also, I think that my point about the flow state was that when you're editing and you're in that flow state, it's even more powerful, I think, in some ways than writing. Because if the writing was self-expression, the editing is almost kind of in dialogue with the imagined reader. And you're now reading your text
That is
from a
so
distance.
fantastic. That is so fantastic. The writing is for you, the editing is for them. I love it.
I didn't say
it.
it that simply, but that's an even better
But
way.
that's the idea. That's the
even
general
clearer.
idea.
Well edited.
Wow. Removing the fat from the literary steak, so to speak.
I think one of the I see one of the ways you work, Keith, is that you extrapolate from things, and let's extrapolate from that principle. Let's get out of writing for a second, and let's just think about human relations, right? Maybe in a lot of the time when we're talking, it's self-expression, and maybe in the listening is our stronger social component. And people who can't listen are pretty boring, aren't they? Right? You've had conversations with people and you hear what they say when you're done speaking, and you get the feeling that they weren't listening to a word you said. And you don't feel inclined to honor them by listening back, right? But when you're in a genuine dialogue, I think after a while it starts to blend. That you're speaking and expressing yourself, but because if you had to relate the conversation, sometimes you're not even sure who said what, because it was just this organic thing that was starting to happen. So that's one of the things you want to have happen as an author, is you want the reader to get so involved in the novel that it's like the novel is happening in them, that it's not an external thing. And that's certainly what's happening in Dungeon Party for the players in this game. They start to get kind of spooked, almost like, wow, this is kind of real. I'm emotionally so invested in this. Is this really happening? Right? And people cry when their characters die in these games, or sometimes they're super proud of having had a good death, that you just get so emotionally invested in it. Well, that's what I think you're trying to achieve in these interviews. People are trying to achieve in games like the ones in Dungeon Party, and I think that's what you and I are trying to do as a writer. Is we're all trying to be in a kind of dialogue with people who really are imagined readers, imagined players, imagined characters. So there's a sense in which we're actively using our imagination in all these different contexts, not just when you're playing a fantasy role-playing game.
So I take it you have an infinite wellspring within you that you can just sit. I don't subscribe nor believe in writer's block. I understand it. Maybe it's my point of view because I'm one of the fortunate and blessed ones. I don't get writer's block. I sit here because I think it actually comes down to sitting where you normally sit and just simply love the art of sitting there, whether you successful or not. I love sitting here. So I'm not in writer's block. When I wrote The Divine Principle, I didn't know how to write a book. I just knew that if I'm going to talk about love, freedom, fear, this, that, jealousy, whatever, I'm just going to clump all that over here in this document and say that and this. And then it all made sense of itself. And so I just learned to get out of the way, and like we were talking about a little earlier, just to express my thoughts. Not judge my thoughts. Don't worry about commas. Don't worry about exclamation points. Use them to a degree to where you get the idea of what you channeled, if you will, at that point. Because a comma will change everything. A comma will change the entire expression of everything. So I've learned to simply just vent, inspire, allow, sculpture. And my measurement stick was always the highest joy.
I love it. I can relate to that with a different twist for writing fiction.
Yeah, right.
So I was expressing myself. I really had fun. You said architecture at one point. I had fun making the architecture of Dungeon Party, and it's a complex novel because it has these parallel worlds. So when you're reading Dungeon Party, most of the time you're reading as the chapters rotate. They rotate from one point of view of one person to another. Actually, this is how um, Game of Thrones is written, with this point of view changes from one chapter to the next. So you get to keep seeing the world through the eyes of these different characters. In the case of Dungeon Party, they're more immediately, they're sitting around the table, right? So it's funny when you change from one chapter to another, it's somebody else who's having the same experiences in the same place or what have you. And that's fun to rotate their point of view like that. But so making the architecture of that was fun, and that was me, right? But there's something else that happens. We talked about the writer and the reader, but there's also the character in the story. In an interview I had a few months ago, someone suggested that I was actually playing a fantasy role-playing game as an author. I was making up the characters. I was making up the adventure. I was like, Sherman Alexie, hiding in the house playing Dungeons and Dragons by himself. I was just doing it as a novel. And there's a truth to that, but there's a weirder truth to it in that I wasn't just writing fantasy characters. I was writing imaginary real people playing fantasy characters. So it was like a game within a game. And it was those, quote, real people in San Diego, California playing the game who turned out to have the strongest voices. And what they, without hopefully me sounding crazy, when I finished the first draft of Dungeon Party, what they said is, hey, mate, this story is really about us. So when you're revising this novel, it's all lovely what's happening in the fantasy world with our fantasy characters, and that's super clever, and I see what you did there. But remember, this story is really about us. It's about real people. So yeah, it's a fantasy novel. And in fact, some of the scenes, as you might guess, are from the point of view of the fantasy character, right, in the story, in the novel. And so that's a fun complexity, right? But they're like, yeah, no, that's cool. That's right. I want you to know what Santana the Sorcerer thinks and feels and sees and fears and loves. And that's great. But it's mostly about me, Carlos, playing Santana, and it's about Alan, and it's about Maya, and it's about Brianna. We're the real heroes of this story. And so as I revised Dungeon Party, it's, if you saw the first draft to the published version, you would say, yeah, this really became more a work of literary fiction and less a clever conceit by an author who had this neat idea about making a book that is both literary fiction and fantasy fiction. It really became more of a serious story about people and their passions and how those shape their lives for better or worse, and the power of fantasy gaming in the real world.
Let me ask you this. We're at the top of the hour, but I notice I have hashtags about politics. And we've been talking about the virtual reality. Let's use that virtual reality and virtual/reality, being married in a delicious spiritual matrix sandwich. So, but I did notice we have not touched at all on this political.
I am never probably going to hear again, and it's a special game I play in my life, which is, have I just heard a phrase? I guarantee you that's the first time.
So now you know who I am. So within that umbrella, that is Keith Anthony Blanchard. That's just my knuckleheaded way of seeing.
Correction, Keith, respectfully. Now I know that I do not know who you are, because that delicious spiritual matrix sandwich, that takes some unpacking. It would be arrogant of me to think that I know you now that I've heard that phrase.
But meaning, the spiritual political, there's a part of you that, as far as some of the videos I've seen, that does some political work. And you and I's virtual versus my spiritual walk, they're so very well paralleled. And somehow they come together. People know me. I use the word sandwich a lot. It's a marriage between two ideas that come together. And you put mayonnaise on it, and everybody loves a good sandwich with mayonnaise. It's just part of my silly nonsense.
Ooh, mayonnaise. Yeah, you had me until the mayonnaise, man.
Mustard, if you will. Does mustard make you feel better?
Please go buy it from the mail. All right. So I can, of course, I can tie this together. So you're right. My day job is I'm a political communication scholar at Penn State, and my unique combination of interests is that I study small group behavior and I study politics. And there's really interesting little niches in our world where people come together as a group and need to do something that has a political function. Um, I spent 10 years of my life studying the jury system because it's this unique system where we almost randomly put people together uh, to play a really important role in our judicial system. Juries are named multiple times in the U.S. Constitution. It's one of the ways we do this democracy thing. This idea of self-government is really manifest in a jury, right? Well, as a small group scholar, when I wanted from, if you will, from a political sense with Dungeon Party, is that gaming can really bring together people who are very different. I mean, the characters in this novel are at different points in their lives. They have different political points of view, and to have, an insurance agent sitting next to a feminist literary critic playing a game together and both completely in love with what they're doing, that's an accomplishment, right? It's not a partisan political clash. It's a clash of, ideologies and worldviews and so on, but that's a creative tension, right? And they become intrigued with what each other sees in the world. The other novel, Gray Matters, is much more consciously about politics, and that's where I take that on more directly. But it's still about a small group. In this case, kind of a small sort of Silicon Valley style tech company in Seattle that thinks they can solve Alzheimer's disease. And the group dynamics within that company are really the heart of the novel, in the same way the group dynamics within the role-playing group is the heart of Dungeon Party. And having watched not just juries, but also all kinds of other random samples of the public brought together for political purposes. My most recent piece of nonfiction is about such a process in Oregon, which helps Oregon voters figure out how to vote on these complex ballot measures. They see a random sample essentially writes a page that goes in their voter guide and helps them understand what's at stake, right? So I see the power of these small groups in the political world. And in the novels, I tell people, hey, it's remarkable what a small group can do. They don't always do good, but they're incredibly powerful. It's remarkably important social unit. And as much as a conversation between the two of us can be really powerful and exciting, when you're in a group, you've got society. And now you've got something more complex. You've got coalitions, you've got majorities and minorities, and you start to understand how society works. And I firmly believe that it's in small groups that you can change society. That if you and I were part of a 6 or 7 person group that was talking about writing and creativity, and let's say somebody did something that really offended you, I don't think you're easily offended, but maybe they really made the case for, all this occult stuff is dangerous, and, you've really got to, and you pushed back gently and said, I want to live in a world where people are free to express themselves in so many different ways. As long as you're not harming somebody else, taking away somebody else's, liberty, you should have, and maybe you change their mind, but you have an effect on them that's different from a conversation, because they're now part of a group dynamic, and they're starting to see how other people are responding to what you just said. And that can have a different kind of impact. So again, tying it back together, I do think we have too few opportunities in the way we do politics these days, whether you're in the UK, the US, or where are you, too few opportunities to sit down with people you disagree with and have a productive conversation and really come from a place of mutual respect, and not just tolerance, but you start to understand why we disagree and, find a way forward. These gamers, can get along even though they have very different ideas about, even within this game, they argue over the rules and so on. They can get past that, and they start to learn how to work together effectively. And that's what we all need to be able to do, whether it's, in writing, in gaming, or in politics. We need to be able to work together effectively.
Everyone, Keith Anthony Blanchard here with my guest, Mr. John. Let me see this right. Gastil, but said a little bit. Gastil. We're hanging out tonight, having a conversation. Good conversation, brother to brother, heart to heart, soul to soul, about his new book, Dungeon Party. We'll take a short pause. Going to be right back. Get some final thoughts from my brand new friend, ancient brother from sister and mother. Let me see what we're going to play tonight. We're going to play You're Perfect. As a gamer, as a shamer, as a sinner or a winner, you're perfect as you are. It's all about being conscious of what you game on. Well, it's simply about self-reflection, looking at who you are and how good you are at manifesting your life or creating your gameplay. See you shortly. Be right back.
Celebrate. There's a time to love and a time to trust and a time to know you are loved. Time to know you are loved. So let the love of God on you. It's always been that way.
Welcome back to Center of Light Radio. Tonight my guest was Mr. John Gastil, or Gastil. We've been talking about his new book, Dungeon Party, having a good time. And I've been doing my thing, which is relating how his beautiful, passionate, like I love passionate people, relates to what I do. And it's the same thing, said differently in a different way. Semantics. Romantics. We're all in it together, and we're all trying to get to this place of sensual, loving what we do. John, thank you for joining me here on Center of Light Radio.
Hey, it's been a great pleasure, and I'll just say to anyone watching or listening, if you want to connect, feel free to go to johngastil.com. You can email me. And for anyone who listened to the show who actually is excited about Dungeon Party and in particular wants an audiobook, I do have a couple credits at Audible And the book is read by Victor Bavine, a professional who's done an amazing job reading the books of R.A. Salvatore. Actually, even the Mueller Report was read by him on Audible. So feel free to get in touch with me, reach out. And I love talking to people, as you saw, Keith. And if you are a fantasy role-playing gamer, one of the things I've really enjoyed doing is talking to gaming groups and really listening to them tell their stories about how games have changed their lives. So the conversation can continue, but it sure has been a pleasure being here with Keith Blanchard.
Blanchard. Right. So blanc means white and shad means car. I'm a white car, and this car moves forward. Let me ask you this. I have no doubt there's an infinite you're probably working on one now, a new book. You always inventing, aren't you?
Yeah. It's kind of my job, not the novel.
I actually understand
writing is
that.
my job. Yeah.
I understand that. It's my job, your job, our job to live in the fire. The fire meaning the place of purification. The fire is that which is passionate, as I mentioned.
That's
that
the more
which
profound job. Yes, you're right.
And we're obligated to be that fire. Because your spark doesn't get any less bright by igniting other torches.
Yeah, and your metaphor works too. As a friend of mine says, die. And fire's die consciousness. And let's enjoy the ride and make something of it, right?
Well, now that you created this, let me ask you this. What is consciousness? Just throw it out there.
Yeah.
Try to define that.
Some combination of, for consciousness, it's self-awareness. And I'll combine that with independent thought. So it's not just, when we say, when does artificial intelligence become conscious? It would have to not only be aware of itself, but capable of independent thought that is more than the sum of its code. And we are certainly, I am confident that we are more than the sum of our code. And we obviously are self-aware. Whether biologically we're reducible to, subatomic particles, I think is a dubious proposition. But
dubious, what a great word.
More importantly, I think it would be a really stupid way to live, to act on that principle that you have no independent thought. And you obviously have chosen to live on the opposite principle, which is that you're making choices all the time in your life. And you're trying to make good choices, and you're trying to make them your own. And I really do respect that. And so it's been a pleasure to be here with you today, because I'm getting to interact with someone who, even right down to the visuals behind you, you're just saying, this is who I am and this is how I'm going to live in the world. And again, the novel Dungeon Party is partly about people kind of figuring out how they want to live in the world. And one of the ways they do that is by playing a game. And that's, I think, kind of like what we're doing here. This is one of the ways you understand the world, is playing a game with your guests and seeing what you learn.
The game of life, Milton Bradley. We're trying to move forward, and we spin, hoping we win. And often we want to spin for better, when maybe just simply realizing what you have is beautiful in heaven in and of itself. And that graduates into greater possibilities versus, let me put a few more dollars in this machine to gamble. It's just nonsense, ramble in the head.
One of the older sort of classic, actually it was a Milton Bradley game, I think, and I played it with an old high school friend of mine at a gaming convention. All these new games, all this exciting, and we played an old game called Careers. Just a stupid old game. But one of the things I liked about it was, at the start of the game, you secretly decide what you want in life. What combination of fame, love, money, and that's your personal story. And as you play the board game with other people, it's a really dumb, conventional looking board game. But I love that it starts with you making that choice. What's important to me is, love.
John, when I was 6 years old, I love that you said that. When I was 6 years old, I had a 10-year-old brother, 10 year older than me brother. I was born in 63, so he was born in 53. But by the time I was 10 years old, he was into the 70s stuff. And so I was a natural born musician. That's what I do for my life, as far as earning my living, until COVID. But as a young boy, I was like, Carrie, Carrie, what is this song? He goes, Keith, I don't, and I try to remember any lyrics and sing it the best. He goes, Keith, I just don't understand what you're trying to tell me. One of the luxuries we had as a family, my parents would take us to the bowling alley. The VHW, is that a word, VHW? Bowling alley. Once a week, once a month, whatever. It just so happened to be that night. So we go to the whatever it is, bowling alley.
Veterans of Foreign Wars, maybe? VFW?
That's it. Yeah. And so I'm at the outstretch, about to throw this 6 pound, 6 years old, 6 pound bowling ball between my legs, hoping to get the best result. And as I did that song I asked my brother about came ripping and roaring out of the jukebox. And I dropped the ball. Of course, I went to the gutter, and I looked at my bro. I said, "That's the song." And that song was the Monkees' Last Train to Clarksville. And in that moment, my divine script was revealed and written. I knew it. I had a revelation about the rest of my life. So in that game of careers that you're speaking about, the rest of my life was seen by me. My mom, when I was 14, 15, wanting to play guitar, she says, Keith, I know you want to be a musician. You're probably going to be really good at it, but go get a job. And I said, I can't. I didn't say that, but internally, I just can't do that. I don't want to work. I want to play.
Right.
I enjoyed my time with you, sir. Thank you.
Hey, it's been a real pleasure. And as we had hoped, it was an unexpected journey. So well done, sir. Well done.
Ditto. Keep us posted what you're doing. You're always welcome back here, sir.
Oh, thank you so much. I will. Take care.
Everyone, John Gastil, make sure you check out his website. I've posted it a few times in these forums. Keith Anthony Blanchard here, Center of Light tonight. I love what I do. I sit in this chair. I swear that's what I just simply love. There's nothing else I want except to love you more. I'll be seeing you soon. Remember, there's nothing more important than you. Everything in all of creation bows down to the presence of your understanding of your deservingness. Remember that. Do you feel so lucky? Maybe toss that wheel a few more times.